Good afternoon and welcome to Hudson Institute. After capturing Nicolás Maduro in an extraordinary operation, the Trump administration is now working to advance an ambitious set of objectives in Venezuela through the government of Delcy Rodríguez. There is no precedent and no playbook for getting a regime to dismantle its own criminal networks, remove malign foreign actors, or put in motion its own demise. The United States faces thorny, interconnected challenges in an uncertain context. However, if the administration can help Venezuela turn the page on the repression and criminality of the Maduro regime and get on a path toward democracy, Venezuela would be transformed and the entire region would benefit. Our distinguished panel will help us navigate these complexities. I am delighted to welcome a group of experts who understand Venezuela's internal dynamics, the calculations of the Trump administration, and the regional implications of what is unfolding. Let me introduce them. Starting to my immediate left, Brian Naranjo retired from the Department of State last year after a 31-year career in the Foreign Service. He had 2 postings in Venezuela, serving as Deputy Chief of Mission from 2014 to 2018, when he was expelled for his advocacy on human rights and democracy. In the middle, John Polga Hasimovich is an associate professor of political science at the U.S. Naval Academy. He is co-editor of a new book, Authoritarian Consolidation in Times of Crisis, Venezuela under Nicolás Maduro. And lastly, Ryan Berg is director of the Americas program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he is also head of the Future of Venezuela initiative. I want to start the discussion considering the immediate aftermath of Maduro's exit, and then shift the focus to the road ahead, and finally examine some of the broader repercussions of the U.S. intervention in Venezuela. Brian, let me start with you. Sure. You dealt directly with interim President Delcy Rodríguez and her team during your time in Caracas. What should the administration expect from her? Will she act as a reliable partner?
So we're going to start with the easy questions. Okay. No, listen, I have had a number of dealings with her from my time when I was in Venezuela, 2014 through 18. They were usually in the capacity of me having to deliver a message to her. She was a foreign minister at the time, and I was periodically chargé d'affaires down there. I think what you're going to find with Delcy Rodríguez is someone who is very presentable to the outside world. She is urbane, she is very educated, she's trilingual, etc. But behind that facade, she is a dyed-in-the-wool ideologue. Okay, I'd like to turn the clock back a little bit so that people understand how she came to where she is today. Maduro, when he came into power in early 2014, really wanted to bring the party in a much more ideological direction, okay? He wanted to move out the old coup plotters from February 4, the 4F members and whatnot, and bring in an ideological element. Her presence and that of her brother, Jorge, who's now the president of the National Assembly, were really some of the big beneficiaries of this. She was elevated through the ranks on Maduro's watch. She was given greater and greater roles, and she built a reputation for getting things done, but always getting them done within a Chavista context. I think that if Trump and this White House that wants to run Venezuela believes they were making an easy choice of someone that's easy to deal with, I think they're very mistaken. She and her brother are, in a strategic sense, deeply committed to the cause of the Chavista revolution. They are, however, extremely adaptable operationally and tactically. My read right now is that you have a table, like a rickety table that your grandma used to have to play bridge on. The legs are all kind of wobbly, okay? And you got 4 elements sitting at that table. The Rodriguezes are on one corner, very ideological. They are whip smart. They can sense the political movements in the room before anyone else gets it, and they will get there quickly before anyone else does, okay? They are now calling for basically a plan that they've run repeatedly over the past 20 years of let's buy space, let's rebuild our strength, let's get our sea legs again. We're going to try to accommodate where we can. We've seen this repeatedly over the years when the international community sought to engage or the opposition has sought to dialogue. When the chips are down and their backs are up, they want to dialogue, they want to negotiate, okay? That is why within 24 hours of President Trump announcing he wanted to run Venezuela, that she was able to pivot and say, I want to collaborate, I want to work with you, I want to dialogue, okay? She's offering some things right now that are going to be very hard to deliver on over time, but she's essentially buying space and time. Another leg of the table is Diosdado Cabello. This is the only former member of the 4F who still has a seat at the table. He is basically taking control of the streets. He controls the colectivos, he controls the national police. He does not, however, get along with the Minister of Defense. Vladimir Padrino Lopez controls the armed forces, is also a creation of Maduro, was pulled out of the ranks to replace Carmen Melendez back in 2014, I believe it was, 15. It's going to sound crazy in a military that is as corrupt and involving illegal activities such as the Venezuelan military, but he still sees himself as something of an institutionalist. He does not want to turn rifles on his own people. And he's been vehement about that and steadfast about that for over 10 years now. The final leg is a little bit more murky. Some of my contacts in Venezuela have been asserting that this is a leg that is managed by Nicolásito. Nicolásito gave a very, the son of Nicolás Maduro. He's a legislator in the National Assembly, gave a very heartfelt and underreported speech on the floor of the National Assembly in which he basically endorsed Delcy as the one who can bring Maduro back, who's going to defend the revolution and whatnot. It's a huge endorsement for her to have, okay? It is believed that he manages a relationship with the Cubans and largely Sabine. The problem with this very rickety table is that it's under inordinate pressure right now. Delcy is going to have to navigate really, really tough waters, okay, to find a way out of this, okay? The demands are being placed on her are taking her in places that it's going to be very uncomfortable for not just any Chavista, but any Venezuelan, okay? You'll notice I've said absolutely nothing about the opposition. This, to my point of view, is the biggest tragedy of what is going on there. The meeting in the White House that the president had with Maria Corina Machado was a devastating blow to the Venezuelan opposition. They're going to be reeling from this. I have no doubt that Maria Corina Machado will try to continue to fight the good fight for democracy there in Venezuela. But I think what we're watching right now is essentially an internal dynamic inside the regime. We did a superb military intervention down there by any stretch of the imagination. But even more than it being a surgical strike, it was a biopsy. We reached in with that long needle the doctor uses, we poked the tumor, and we pulled out two cells, Nicolás Maduro and Celia Flores. The rest of the tumor's there. I'm not sure we needed the biopsy to diagnose cancer in Venezuela, but that's where we are, and I'll leave it at that.
Wow, sobering. Thank you, Brian. John, as Maduro was able to hold together several competing factions within the regime, plus a variety of armed groups that operate in different parts of the country. Will Delcy Rodríguez be able to maintain similar cohesion? And what might cause one of these actors or one of these groups to turn against her?
Another easy question. First of all, thank you for the invitation, Dan and Hudson Institutes. Everything that I have to say today as an employee of the Naval Academy is my own personal opinion. It does not reflect the perspective or opinion of the U.S. Naval Academy, Department of the Navy, Department of War, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. So Nicolás Maduro had a superpower, right? He was really, really good at one thing, which was coalition management. He managed through crises from the very moment he took office in 2013, before he took office, quite frankly, to hold together all the disparate factions that Brian just articulated, right? And to keep people happy and to push out others like Tarek El Aissami at an opportune moment for Maduro, maybe not for Tarek. He managed to double down on these Chavista policies, right, in 2013, 2014, in order to present kind of continuity between Chavez and himself, right? He then drew back from that after the 2019 crisis and the interinato that almost removed him and became a little more pragmatic economically, right? Pushed in part through the pragmatism of the Rodriguez siblings, right? So he's not a charismatic guy. He didn't have true ideological innovation. It was all about this management, right? senior military officers, intelligence services, party hardliners, economic insiders, colectivos, transnational criminal networks. And I think that there are three pillars upon which this rested and upon which Delcy is going to have to deal right now. Right? First of all, calibrated patronage. And the second thing, selective repression. We're seeing still selective repression in Venezuela, right? Reports from people that I know, that I'm sure many of us know in this room, on the streets in Venezuela with cell phones still being, looked over at alcabalas from the National Guard and things like that. People didn't en masse go out and party on the streets on January 3rd in Venezuela. There was a fear, and I think that speaks to the political moment, right? And then the strategic balancing of the rival power centers. So, Delcy inherits this coalition, and she does so, I think, under far less favorable conditions than Maduro did. So I think sustained cohesion, I'm going to say, is uncertain. That's how I'm going to frame it. And I don't think that I diverge in any meaningful way from Brian's analysis. I think that Delcy lacks several of Maduro's advantages insofar as she does not command deep personal loyalty from the armed forces or the security services. Her power derives less from this factional balancing than from external backing, and I think that is notable. And if we know anything about the history of external backing for transitions like this and for internal management of governments, there aren't many success stories, right, in the long term. She is, I guess, a technocratic influence, but this is only relative to everyone else.
A very low bar.
That's exactly right. And so I think there are four fault lines that threaten regime cohesion, in my opinion. And they intersect a lot with what Brian said. And I think the first is the rivalry between Rodriguez and Diosdado Cabello, something that has been in the news quite a bit. The Guardian today published an article that alleges that Delcy and Diosdado had been in contact with U.S. government for months before January 3rd, right? That maybe they didn't carry out the coup, they didn't carry out the seizure of Maduro, but they did say that they would take over and manage things if he were gone. So Cabello controls these coercive institutions, and maintains really deep ties to the colectivos and intelligence services. The colectivos would be happy to act autonomously anyway. And so I think there's even a question, does Diosdado command their loyalty in the long term, right? Let alone Delcy. So I think if Diosdado perceives Delcy's cooperation threatens his survival or access to rents, that could spell the end of that relationship. The second is the military's conditional loyalty, which is Padrino Lopez, the Minister of Defense, who now has celebrated, as of October, I no longer remember if it's 12 years in office or something like that. Every other Minister of Defense dating back to 1999 lasted an average of 11 months. And so Diosdado is 10 times that, which means he is a key, has a key stake in the maintenance of the status quo. And I wrote down here, he prioritizes institutional survival. And my wife, who is Venezuelan, got angry at me for saying this after the elections in 2024.
My wife's Venezuelan. I can commiserate 100%.
He's not institutional, and yet he strangely is actually very institutional and does not want to turn weapons on Venezuelan citizens. And indeed, during the most repressive periods of the past couple of years, it's been colectivos, and it's been the National Guard, and it's been SEBIN and others who have done this rather than the Army or the Navy or especially the Air Force. So is she able to maintain his loyalty? Because it is very, very conditional, and he doesn't want to see too many changes either. I'm almost done, I promise. Third, armed civilian networks that underpinned Maduro's role, right? And so we have colectivos, we have other criminalized actors like the sindicatos in the mining arc, right, in eastern Venezuela. You have guerrilla groups, Colombian guerrilla groups, the ELN and non-demobilized FARC and all sorts of criminal elements. Their loyalty is transactional and not ideological. Okay, so if funding dries up for them, if leadership fractures or repression becomes inconsistent, I think these groups could turn predatory or align themselves with rival elites, and that would be incredibly dangerous for Delcy and for the United States, right? I think that's a worst case scenario type situation. And finally, she faces this deficit that Maduro didn't, insofar as she may be perceived as simply this interim figure that is a figurehead, right? That is a representative of Washington rather than her own person. And maybe Washington needs it or wants it to be that way. But for her to maintain the loyalty of these distinct factions, I don't think she can be perceived that way. So I think she can only maintain cohesion under some pretty narrow conditions. She has to thread a needle, continued external backing, careful accommodation of security elites, avoidance of rapid reforms that threaten entrenched interests. And just like Brian, I have not mentioned the opposition at all in this, because sadly the opposition is not a part of this. I think it bears mention that Maria Corina Machado was not in Venezuela on January 3rd, purposeful or not, and thus could not mobilize Venezuelans to take to the streets, and has not yet been able to do so. And that to me is also a tragedy for the country.
Terrific insights, John. Thanks. Ryan, how has Maduro's exit already changed the situation for China and other U.S. adversaries that had a presence in Venezuela? How might they be positioning themselves for this next phase in Venezuela?
Well, thanks, Dan. It's great to be on this panel here at Hudson. I think there are a number of layers here to unpack, but the bottom line up front is I think this is a potential reset moment for the U.S. with the region. There's a lot of fallout from this. I think China and Russia especially have taken a step back and they're evaluating at this point. Is the language in the National Security Strategy document that was released in December, is it serious? Is it not? What does the Trump corollary of the Monroe Doctrine mean for us? What does it not mean? What are the Americans going to do in practice? What are they going to do in word only? And less than a month later, you have this extraordinary political operation. You have the NSS in mid-December. Less than a month later, you have this extraordinary political operation, which I think in some ways proves that the Trump corollary is sort of prescriptive. It's guiding some of the policies that the administration is pursuing, and I think that is going to cause the Chinese and the Russians, at least in the short term, to step back a little bit and evaluate what they've lost and how they might move forward from here. Let me just go through a couple elements here. I think on the first level and the most obvious level, there's the oil bit, right? Everything that we're doing with the ongoing quarantine, everything that we're doing to determine where Venezuela gets to send its oil, and most importantly, where it doesn't get to send its oil, and where previously it had sent its oil. That sends messages. Today, we've seen that the administration has affirmed its initial position that they will allow the Chinese to buy Venezuelan oil, but not with the discount on the Brent crude prices that they were getting because Venezuelan oil was sanctioned. And so China will have a decision to make. Does it want to make up for about 5% of its overall oil imports with oil from another country, or does it want to pay more for Venezuelan oil? This is not leverage to the extent that the Chinese have on us in rare earths and critical minerals, but I think it should be seen as an attempt by the United States to build a modicum of leverage on the Chinese. If anything happens to go sideways in our bilateral relationship with China, we want to send them a message. The Venezuelan oil goes elsewhere, right? Good luck finding 5% of your daily imports from another country, right? Again, not equivalent to the leverage the Chinese have built on us in other spaces, but it's something. With the Russians, I think there's a message there of how much they've actually lost in their folly in Ukraine, right? They've lost Syria. They damn near lost Iran. And now they were unable to answer the mail on Venezuela. Where were the Russian S-300 and Buk weapons systems at 2 a.m. local time on January 3rd? Where were the Chinese radars? Nowhere to be found in either case. And so there's a weapons system and defense and security analysis here as well. Who do you want to train with? Whose weapons systems do you want to buy? Who's got the goods? Who doesn't? The Americans come out looking very good in this case, and I know already that a number of Latin American countries have reached out saying, wow, we saw the performance on January 3rd. We know who we want to not only buy from, but also to train with. More broadly, I think there's some messaging here for the axis of authoritarians concept. And we've seen, I think, in multiple instances now, twice, I would say, in the last 8 months, the limits of the so-called axis of authoritarians to be able to help each other. We know that Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and their partner countries like Venezuela, like Cuba, and like Nicaragua in our region are cooperating. But the limits of that cooperation, I think, have been put on display in the last 8 months. First in the 12-day war in Iran, when China and Russia didn't answer the mail there, and then again here in Venezuela. If you are an all-weather strategic partner of the Chinese anywhere in the world, and you are relying on the Chinese or you're relying on the Russians for the most important question, frankly, if you're an authoritarian regime, which is the question of regime security, right? If those partners aren't there for you when the chips are on the table and you absolutely need them, what good are they? What utility value do they have ultimately? And I think it's important to note that Maduro didn't ask them to send troops, right? He didn't ask them to help repel an American operation in his country. It was widely reported that starting in September or October of last year, he was sending multiple missives to some of these partners saying, please give me additional maintenance on the weapons systems, please give me additional training, like we need a little bit more, but he wasn't asking for boots on the ground or that kind of thing where you might say, well, that was an unreasonable expectation, right? He was asking for the bare minimum, and he didn't get it from either. And again, I think that shows the limits of the axis of authoritarians, and again, it goes back to what I think is the ultimate folly of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is that they've been losing lots of allies around the world as they've been myopically focused on this awful war in Ukraine. And then lastly, a small but quick point about Cuba, which is a bit of an unfinished point, I would say at this point, because we don't really know where policy is going on Cuba, but the president has very clearly signaled that Cuba could be next. Again, the leverage that the U.S. has over where Venezuelan oil goes means that Cuba is in big trouble, especially if the Mexicans don't step up their exports to Cuba. It was reported, I think, yesterday that the Cubans were going to multiple countries in Africa, I think to the Angolans and maybe was it the Liberians or something, or Ivory Coast, somewhere for some of their oil to replace what they expected to be losses from Venezuela and probably very few barrels of oil per day coming from Mexico. So there's major regime security questions in Cuba as well. So that's why I say I think it is a potential reset moment. I think the Chinese feel like they're under greater scrutiny in the region. The Russians feel like they've lost a major beachhead in the region. The Iranians have certainly lost, and they're reeling themselves, right, with domestic constraints. It's a significant moment, I think, for geopolitics, showing the limits of some of these elements of cooperation for our adversaries.
Yeah. So we'll be talking more about Cuba and some of the other geopolitical reverberations. But first, I want to shift gears to the Venezuelan economy for a minute. Brian, a key factor that will shape possibilities in Venezuela is whether the interim government can get the economy moving. Yep. Much of the focus has been on the oil industry, but virtually every sector of the Venezuelan economy is in shambles. What needs to happen, and what role should the U.S. play in jumpstarting the economy of Venezuela?
And the softball questions keep coming. Look, I think I would begin, Dan, from the point that I don't think we know how the Venezuelan economy is functioning today. All right, you have an oil sector that has been in rapid decline now, going on 2 decades now. That's largely been factored into the markets. When I was in Venezuela in the late 90s, they were accounting for about 11-12% of world production. Today, it's less than 0.5%. All right. We've read all in the media about the different challenges of extracting Venezuelan oil and things like that. As important as that is, I think that is probably only a minority kind of, or a small understanding of the broader economy. My sense is that over the years, Venezuela's economy has become ever more irregular and defies real categorization and whatnot. Why smuggle cocaine in Venezuela when you can make far more money smuggling gasoline or harina pan? Okay, there is a network that is bringing in things from outside the country in ways that are not recorded. It is largely an import-based economy still. Those goods are being paid for offshore by selling money from your account in the coconut grove to your cousin's account over in Houston, and that's how you settle bills and whatnot. But everything from household goods through auto parts, through cars themselves, through clothing and whatnot, are coming in ways that we don't entirely understand. Many of those routes are most likely being controlled or at least influenced by guys in uniform, other unsavory types and whatnot. I guess my concern here is if we focus too much on this oil and we actually clamp down on what's still dripping out of the pipeline that used to gush in Venezuela, we will find that the economy is still humming along, okay? In a way that we want to see? No. Something that's a lot closer to Haiti? Sure. But it's going to be somewhere between those extremes. So much wealth that is used to purchase and pay for things is offshore now, okay? You don't buy things with bolivars. You buy them with dollars either in hard cash, which is now legal, or by transferring money offshore. So I think one of the things we really have to start wrapping our minds around, this is more a challenge to everyone else out there. I am not an economist, but one of the things I've not seen much reporting or analysis on is how is the economy even functioning right now?
One of the things we're about to find out more about, though, Brian, is exactly how poorly this economy is working, because we are going to have much greater scrutiny over how the government is spending much of the revenues which finance those imports that you talked about. The way the controls that the administration has put on spending will give us a lot greater insight into what exactly the economy is doing.
We basically turned the clock back 100 years and taken Venezuela into receivership, like we've done the Dominican Republic and Haiti and other countries in the region. That's the kind of, I mean, we should be sending not so much a former ambassador to Caracas now as an IRS technician, a green eye shade with a stumpy pencil, because that's essentially how we're trying to coerce the country right now.
John, a democratic transition has not been sort of front and center in the administration's communications about Venezuela. What are the prospects in your view for some form of transition in the year ahead?
Obviously, I think we would all love a democratic transition in Venezuela more than anything else, and that should be the end goal. That is how I'm going to start that. My very pessimistic answer. So, I think realistically, Venezuelans enjoyed democracy from 1958 to the late 90s, early 2000s, and through times in which the rest of Latin America was struggling with under the weight of military dictatorships, and Venezuela was very resilient during these times. A number of factors went into the collapse of Venezuelan democracy, but I think that Venezuelans are small d Democrats, right? At heart, they want liberal democracy. The route to building that, though, is quite complicated, and it involves an immense amount of support. It would involve an immense amount of support from the United States, as well as regional allies like Colombia, Brazil, and other places. It would require, forced and enforced negotiations and deals brokered by the United States to sit Chavismo down with the opposition to build a unity government, I suspect, in order to truly negotiate the process of democratization, right? Because to me, the fear is what happens, and I think the fear that perhaps the Trump administration held was, what if we hand over the government to the opposition and it doesn't command the loyalty of all these forces that we were talking about, right? Is that going to plunge the country into chaos, into civil war, into what? Unrest? And so I think it needs to be a process where all parties are forced to sit down and thinking about some of the most successful democratic transitions from the late 20th century in Latin America. They involved these types of negotiations, right, with the outgoing dictatorship as well as the incoming democracy. So I think that certainly is plausible, but it will require kind of heavy investment. It might involve, boots on the ground even to enforce that peace in Venezuela. And I think there are two other scenarios, right? And I think one is maybe kind of the space we're in right now, which is a reaccommodation of authoritarianism, maybe slight liberalization, Delcy being forced to release some political prisoners, but maybe not all, in a piecemeal fashion, maybe allowing some freedoms, but not all freedoms, right? Keeping the same actors largely in place, but moving back from 2024, 2025 to like 2016 Venezuela, 2015 Venezuela, right? Which is more of a hybrid regime, but still
authoritarianism.
Pretty competitive authoritarianism, or maybe between competitive authoritarianism and authoritarianism, in order to guarantee a greater stability and a better investment climate. I think that the worst case scenario is one in which some of the actors chafe at the pressure being placed on them. They chafe at the coercion. They chafe at the United States being nominally in charge of Venezuela, and they act out. I think this is sadly, I think it's a real possibility. I don't think it's the most likely possibility, but I think it's a real possibility, and that would involve probably a low intensity conflict. It's some type of insurgency.
And most likely to be conflict within the regime, quite frankly, as people's rice bowls are threatened or access to things.
That's right. Yeah. And so I think that could happen as well. Clearly, there are many different scenarios that can emerge and hybrids of these three basic scenarios, but I think you have democracy, you have kind of a reaccommodation of authoritarianism, and you have kind of regime breakdown where it would require truly boots on the ground in order to reassert stability. Yeah.
Ryan, I want to get your perspective on this as well. I mean, where do you see things headed? Can you envision the current arrangement with the interim president enduring for a while, or do you see some change? Do you see any of the scenarios John mentioned happening, or do you have other scenarios in mind?
Well, I coincide with John in the sense that I don't think it's a very stable situation at the moment. And Brian also gave us a very interesting metaphor, the rickety table. I mean, put yourself in Delcy Rodríguez's shoes for a second. You have to manage these difficult, very nice. Although it was noted that her very neon suit was matched with some track shoes the other day when meeting with the CIA director. Nevertheless, put yourself in her shoes for a second. You have to manage these difficult coalitions that Maduro previously managed. You have to, at the same time, deal with the United States that's bringing an immense amount of leverage on how you're managing the country. You have to dispel, at the same time, rumors, which now seem to be grounded very much in truth, given the Guardian article that John mentioned, that you were part of at least giving tacit approval to Maduro's capture. Right? While at the same time satisfying some of the hardliners within the regime who may chafe, to John's point, at this arrangement over time. And at the same time, you're supposed to pursue policies that are very pro-U.S. and that basically allow Venezuela's oil sales final customers to be determined by the U.S. and how you spend that money to be determined by the U.S. It's a very difficult thing to manage. And by the way, this is something we haven't talked about, but because each person within the regime has their own kind of silo of corruption, but also patronage networks. Mm-hmm. And John mentioned very importantly, hers is not in the military. Hers is not in the intelligence services. That's going to be very, very difficult for her. But also with the way that the U.S. is going to be managing Venezuela's resources, there's simply going to be fewer opportunities for corruption. What happens when the trough all of a sudden gets much smaller than it used to be? What happens when there's a higher level of scrutiny placed on who gets the contracts from the state? What happens when know your customer, know your client rules come into play because the banks that are involved in these complex processes, from Qatar to the four that we've signaled in Venezuela to the eventual companies that will get the contracts, are under immense scrutiny from the U.S. government, right? None of those questions are answered. So to give you my direct answer, I think this is a very short-term solution. This is a stopgap solution. This is answering the question of political stability first, mm-hmm. while questions of political legitimacy are put on hold. Mm-hmm. But let's be clear, what we've seen here over the last week, I disagree with the two gentlemen on the stage in one important aspect, which is that the opposition has been somehow invisible. Maria Corina Machado has been omnipresent this week up on Capitol Hill. She did have her meeting with the president. She has been in D.C. last week and this week. And the outpouring of support on Capitol Hill has been pretty uniform, both Republicans and Democrats. There must be a transition at some point. There must be an election. And so as long as that remains, I think, in some point in the equation, there will be folks, even within the Republican Party, who are pushing for the transition part of the three-pronged approach to come into the picture. The longer we delay this, the risk is the more someone like Maria Corina Machado and her immense political potential contributions to the country are at risk, because what does she do during this period, right? How does she remain relevant? How does she remain at the forefront of driving discussions on Venezuela? So that's why I get the sense that there's going to be a push to get to the transition phase much sooner than maybe my colleagues here on the panel think that there might be. And that's going to come from the Congress, and I think it's also going to come from important voices within the administration.
On the question of legitimacy, I think most would agree that this interim government is no more legitimate than the Maduro government. Just thinking out loud, is there a potential midpoint of legitimacy that's somewhere in between this interim government and a democratically elected government that serves as a midpoint on the way to elections?
That's a good question. Let me put on my political theory hat for a second with John here up on the stage. So, in the democracy literature, you basically say there are two origins of legitimacy. Basically, you're legitimately elected in sort of a democratic election, or you're acting democratically, like you're behaving democratically. Well, this regime lacks both. And we don't anticipate, it's obviously not going to surmount the election challenge unless we really put the issue of transition at the forefront. And all of us, I think, doubt that it's going to all of a sudden begin behaving democratically. So I don't see how the question of legitimacy is answered until we get to the point of an election. But let me just say one thing, which is part of the calculation that the Delcy folks must have is that they probably are thinking that they can recover at least a modicum of electoral competitiveness.
That's right.
If they are seen as presiding over even a slight economic recovery. And that does provide a little bit of incentive for them, in addition to sanctions, in addition to the legal ways that we can coerce from here in Washington or in the Southern District of New York, in addition to the ongoing quarantine. There's the issue of, do we want to recover a little bit of our electoral competitiveness? Please, Venezuelans and friends of the Venezuelan cause in the audience, don't interpret me as saying they are going to become electorally competitive. No. But maybe they go in the polls from 10% support to 15% support or 20% support, to the point where they think maybe the amount of fraud we would have to engage in is not as significant as what Maduro engaged in on July 28th of 2024.
I think you make an important point that conditions could get better, the economy could get moving again, it could make the current interim government put them in a very good position.
Slightly more popular.
Yeah. One of my concerns is if this partnership starts to work well, that the United States gets more invested in the endurance of the
status quo
of this arrangement. I'd love any of you to comment on that.
It's been, 19 days, I think, since the U.S. intervention. Much of the dust has not even settled yet. I'm no academic by any stretch of the imagination. I'm more of a shoe leather diplomat who believes diplomacy is a contact sport than anything else. My gut is just, deeply worried that we're going to be caught in a position of maintaining an authoritarian regime in Venezuela. And unfortunately, when the elephants start fighting, the grass is what suffers. And I think that that's what's happening here with the Venezuelan people. Regarding your question on legitimacy, from an American perspective, I would immediately say no. The Venezuelan president is appointed by the president. The president was not legitimate. Therefore, there's no way that Delcy has any real legitimacy. From a Venezuelan perspective, the perspective I go home to every night, I'm the only non-Venezuelan in my household. My wife, my daughter, my in-laws, my cat, they're all Venezuelan. Would think it would be very quaint to be talking about legitimacy. Okay.
Right.
They're going about shoring themselves up the way a mafia boss does when the capo de capos has just been capped. Okay. What did she do? She went to the Supreme Court. This is not a famed institution of jurisprudence anywhere in the world, okay, and got them to basically come down with this hair-splitting decision that Delcy, no, you're not the acting president because we have our president, albeit behind bars in Brooklyn, okay? You're the interim president. Well, why is that helpful? It means they don't have to go to elections in 30 days, okay? And then she dashes to the National Assembly and gets the same thing. It's not like these are huge debating institutions that were cloaking her in the garlands of democratic legitimacy. But it is the way that, quite frankly, you go around to your different families in New York and get the kissing of the ring and everything done. It doesn't bode well right now. I'm worried about the opposition because opposition politicians from Venezuela have an extraordinarily short half-life once they leave the country. All right. You're absolutely right. Maria Corina's been out there an awful lot these past couple of weeks. But it's disappointing that it had to rely on the minority whip of the Senate to pull together a bipartisan meeting. And he's retiring at the end of this term. Durbin has been very invested in Venezuela now going on 10 years. How many more Congress people are really interested in that kind of thing right now? Where is the support for the kind of sustained engagement that we're going to have to do in a place like Venezuela? And then even more importantly, what are we going to use? Our foreign assistance tools have been obliterated. Our foreign service has been decimated. The centuries of experience just on Venezuela that have departed is really evident right now because we're able to talk freely in public like I am right now. We are stretched right now. And the other thing that really worries me is that we have alienated all of our natural partners in the hemisphere. We are alone on this right now, okay? And I'm looking at Roger, former assistant secretary here. It is a pain in the ass to deal with Brazilians and Mexicans and Argentines and Colombians to try to get together on anything in the hemisphere, let alone Venezuela. But it can be done. I'm just not seeing that kind of engagement going on right now. And so I'm worried for what the future here is for that kind of engagement that's necessary. I really am. Yeah. Sorry, I pontificated.
No.
Dan, we've got our work cut out for us in terms of, no, but as the two think tankers here on the panel, we try to build congressional audiences that are interested in these issues that we really care about. So we've got work to do here in terms of rebuilding on the Hill folks who care about Venezuela.
John, changing gears a bit, President Trump has said that the Cuban government should make a deal if it wants to avoid the same fate as Maduro. Do you think the Cubans are getting this message, and what kind of developments might we see in Cuba?
I think everyone in the hemisphere is getting a message, right? I think that's pretty clear in Mexico, that Mexico is getting the message, that Colombia under Petro is getting the message, that maybe Panama is getting the message. The Cubans certainly should have gotten the message. We haven't discussed the failure of Cuban security services in Venezuela on January 3rd. 32 dead Cubans, right?
Huge intel.
They certainly weren't all bodyguards, right? They were in different physical locations that morning. And so what does that say about Cuba? Is Cuba shaken? I suspect so. And fearful of what comes next, absolutely. Will it happen? I think that's anyone's guess. Yeah.
Brian, the administration has articulated several different objectives in Venezuela. In the current arrangement, what is our ability to achieve these objectives? How do you think they should be prioritized or sequenced?
Okay, so we don't have to worry about democracy and rule of law, respect for human rights. Just take that off the agenda. Right. For me, that would have been the number one priority. That's not this administration's priority, apparently. I think that would have been essential because if you really want to go in and try and restore prosperity, you have to have that rule of law that is really essential. And you need to have that democratic stability. Okay, set that to the side. Right now, it appears to be, extracting mineral and oil wealth from the country. I would like to see a little bit more attention being paid to internal stability issues related to what's going on in southwestern, Venezuela, on the border with Colombia. This is not an area that I'm really up to speed on right now, but the more and more I look at it, the more and more I'm disturbed by the very non-ideological relationships that are being built out there to extract rare earths, gold, other materials. These are remnants of the FARC. It's remnants of the ELN and whatnot. It's not just about rest and relaxation and shipping drugs to Honduras from there right now. But I think that is something that we ought to be deeply concerned about. I think we ought to be very concerned about the possibility of proliferation out of Venezuela of man pads. They have thousands of SA-24s, which do not appear to have been used on January 3rd. Do those stay under control? That is an enormous threat to aviation in the United States. I'm not that concerned about drugs. It is a hardy perennial in Venezuela, but most of the drugs moves up the Pacific coast of the Americas. It's not really even going by air bridge into Central America anymore. Europeans should be very concerned about that. It's transshipping via Africa into Europe and whatnot. But it's not the fentanyl that is killing 100,000 people a year in the United States. I am really trying to get my bearings in this wild game of bingo where all these events that happened over the past 19 days just simply weren't there. It would be, frankly, for me, the top priority to get some transition going here, but I just don't know how that process gets started at this point.
Dan,
Yeah,
if I
go
can,
ahead,
just to add to what Brian said, but to give it the international lens. So I've been thinking a lot lately about how do we, if at all possible, achieve one of the other objectives that the administration has stated very clearly, which is unwinding some of Venezuela's problematic geopolitical the adversaries that it's brought into in the region in a major way. How do we unwind those relationships? How do we even begin to think about that? Which ones? Right? Are we most concerned about China? Are we most concerned about Russia? Are we most concerned about Iran? Some of the proxy groups? Is it the Venezuela-Cuba nexus? How much? Right? What's reasonable to expect? And on what timeline? Do we want a rupture? A very firm sort of point in time when we say, all right, no more Russia, no more China, no more Cuba, no more Iran? Or is this a slow recalibration, right, away from some of these problematic geopolitical partnerships that Venezuela has maintained for many decades now? Are we going to have metrics for how this is done, or is the administration going to retain flexibility and therefore optionality, as it often likes to have? Are we more concerned about symbolic acts, right? Do we want to see tons of Cubans go home, right? We've seen already a couple trips of Cuban doctors go back on vacation, back home to Cuba, right? Is that what we want to see, or do we want to actually see meaningful breaks in some of these relationships over time and map them in a very careful way? That work I don't think has been done yet, but if we're serious about unwinding some of Venezuela's partnerships with these geopolitical adversaries in the heart of South America, I think we need to put more thought into that as part of the international side of achieving some of these objectives the administration has outlined.
Yeah, important point. Ryan, can you talk about how the removal of Maduro fits into the national security strategy?
Well, I wrote back in December, I've been taking the administration at their word. I think that they're serious about the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine idea. Again, I think it's prescriptive and not just a mere bluster. But that's a contentious point, right? There's a debate within our community, folks who look at Latin America and do Latin America analysis about how literally to take the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And in that same piece of analysis in December, I said, I think the most immediate challenge to the idea of a 21st century Monroe Doctrine is Venezuela, right? The long-term challenge, I think, is Mexico, right? Finding stability and continuing economic integration and building economic security with Mexico, while at the same time bringing it away from the brink of being a narco state. But the short-term challenge to that is to the idea of a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is Venezuela, and that was 3 weeks before Operation Absolute Resolve. So I think from the administration's perspective, right, they think, okay, we have a pathway here to solve in a three-pronged approach the Venezuela challenge to the corollary. Yeah. And now and there have been very clear signals that Mexico is now under much greater scrutiny than it already had been, and it already had been under a significant microscope. So I think this all fits within a package of, like, look, the U.S. is back in the Western Hemisphere. We're back in a major way. The administration is benefiting from a new constellation of governments, a new panorama in the region, governments that want to work with the United States. They're looking for more engagement. The fallout from the operation was basically quite minimal. I mean, Brian said we don't have as much regional partnership as we'd like, rebuilding Venezuela and moving forward with the three-pronged approach. But to go back before that, we didn't see the regional outcry
No, yeah, absolutely.
that we would have expected if I had just said in a hypothetical scenario, U.S. operation to capture a de facto president in a country, you would have expected a lot of outcry. Mm-hmm. And that's because the polls show, depending upon where you're looking, between 90% support and low 50s support for the removal of Maduro. This is a guy who had classically overworn his welcome in the region. And so we didn't suffer that. The administration, I think, is a beneficiary of the shifting tides or the pendulum shift in the region. And then the message, as I said before, the message that it sends in terms of the scrutiny that other countries are likely to expect on investment, any kind of partnership deals, getting more deeply involved with the Russians or with the Chinese, I think will cause everyone to kind of hit the pause button for a second, step back, and to see what fills the void. And that's the opportunity for the U.S. The void is there. Yeah. Do we fill it with content, right? Do we fill it with partnership ideas? Do we fill it with economic offers? Do we fill it with stuff that can pull countries away?
If the polling is to be believed, the ousting of Maduro was much more popular in Latin America than in the United States. Mm-hmm. The polling in the United States is quite tepid. And I get the sense that the U.S. electorate, except for portions of the electorate, it's hard for many Americans to get excited about assertive U.S. action in our hemisphere. Do you see this as possibly a constraint to the administration's emphasis on dominance in the Western Hemisphere, or do you think this is something that Americans get used to, and that the U.S. action in Venezuela could be a validation of the administration's emphasis?
I think I'll give a quick answer and leave space for John to respond as well, because I think his perspective will be important on this. While there are constraints, I have seen polls that are showing that now that the operation has been explained and the objectives have been explained, that those numbers are going up. I think the Wall Street Journal had a poll 2 days ago where it was basically 50-50 in terms of support, and I fully admit we've seen War Powers resolutions now on 3 occasions on both sides of Congress move forward. But so far, those restraints haven't been placed. The other thing I would say is, if you read the Trump corollary does not presage tons of military action, right? It's actually more concerned with strategic control by our adversaries of critical infrastructure, significant economic pieces, strategic geographies. It doesn't necessarily say that the U.S. is going to revive the Roosevelt corollary and be militarily active all over the region. And then the other point to make is, as Dan Kane said at the Saturday morning press conference after the operation, this was 6 months of preparation, right? You don't have the capability to do these kinds of interventions and these kinds of military operations all over the hemisphere with regularity, right? There's a lot that goes into planning this just from the logistical perspective alone. So I'm not forecasting that we're going to see military operations on a sort of routine basis from here on out. I think this is a pretty sui generis situation, but it does kind of set the tone for, I think, the administration's message that we are back in the hemisphere in a way that many in the region, I think, didn't even expect the U.S. to be.
Thank you, Ryan.
John wanted to.
I also think it's worth pointing out that which 50% is supportive of it and which 50% isn't, sure. Right? That a lot of domestic policies or international policies made domestically, public opinion is driven by partisanship rather than the success or failure of the operation. How many Americans can pinpoint Venezuela on a map or name more than one city in the country or 2 cities? Probably not many, right? And so I think, will that be a constraint on the administration? In my opinion, not at all, because I suspect that supporters of the administration are overjoyed, right? And are I think, rightfully celebrating the military success, right? This very precise, well-planned and well-executed extraction, right? And so will it be a constraint on other potential operations in the hemisphere? I don't think so. I think quite the contrary. I think it serves as evidence of how successful this can be.
It certainly helps that it was an overnight operation, and in the morning, Americans woke up and they heard about a new reality. It was almost like the David Copperfield of regime changes. Like, now you see Maduro, now you don't. Right? The curtain goes down, it goes back up, all of a sudden he's not there anymore. It's like a magic show, right?
Most of America wasn't awakened by their wife.
Precisely because it was so precise, it was so surgical, and it was so quick, right? The demonstration of U.S. capabilities. That it's easier for Americans, I think, to understand that than if we had gotten into a quagmire, if boots had been on the ground for more than 2 hours, et cetera.
We are running out of time, but we have a great audience today. I'd like to open it up for one or two questions before we go back to the panel for concluding remarks. So if you have any questions, there's a mic in the back. Yep. No, it's coming to you.
Fantastic, great questions, great panel. Let me make a bid to support the quaint notions of democracy and the rule of law as a way out here, because you're not going to unlock the potential economically of Venezuela and the great opportunities that come with contracts to rebuild the country. And you're not going to be able to placate the people of Venezuela in the long run. And then even on the Hill, they see the upside. I've had talked to Republicans and as well as Democrats. They see the upside of getting elections scheduled. Yes. And then it will also make it easier for folks in the region, the Malay, caste, Abinader, to come out in favor of this if it isn't some sort of a pragmatic deal with the current regime. So, I mean, isn't there an upside? I mean, how would you see that? How would you make that case to the president that he needs to, focus more attention on the blocking and tackling of getting a change and locking things down in Venezuela? And that it's worth the effort.
Start with Ryan.
Just
Did you have a thought?
Easy answer.
I think you can do two things. First, review his own words, right? If you look at what he said at the Saturday morning press conference after the operation, he said, "We did not do this in vain. We wanted to make Venezuela great again." As we've been saying, you can't make Venezuela great again unless it comes back into the community of democratic nations in the Western Hemisphere. And then the second argument that I would make is that there's a means-ends connection that you were getting at in what you were saying. We want additional oil production in Venezuela to lead a broader-based economic recovery.
That's the answer.
Yeah.
You don't get it unless you have that means-ends connection. I would refrain from talking about democracy and democracy promotion as this kind of flowery notion. It's a values-based argument. I'm a small d Democrat. I love democracy, but I understand that there's a means-ends connection that's probably more important in the political moment where we find ourselves right now than talking about democracy in this sort of values-based, flowery way that we sometimes tend to talk about it. So use the president's own words, and you'll find there that I think there's some stuff to build on, and then the means-ends connection.
I would keep it short and sweet to maintain his attention, and I would say, sir, this is what makes the most economic sense, period.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I'm just gobsmacked that I would have to brief the president on that.
Any other questions in the back?
Thank you very much. I have a question regarding Diosdado Cabello. I think the second biggest surprise of January 3rd was that Diosdado was still alive or in Venezuela. To what extent, you touch upon it on the presentation, but to what extent is he the biggest spoiler for a potential transition in Venezuela? And if Venezuela was moving, or Delcy was moving towards democracy, will we still see Diosdado taking photos with her or around in government? Thank you.
So I got an interesting question from a journalist I briefed through kind of, Delcy is buying for time and to get the sea legs back, and she's going to negotiate and engage and things like that. And they said, well, isn't that going to upset the other legs of the table? And I said, no, absolutely not, because this is a play pattern that has been run repeatedly. They know how this works. And Diosdado knows how it works. He knows what his role is on it, okay? His role is to instill fear on the streets so people don't come out and celebrate the capture of Maduro, don't celebrate it, and they can't demonstrate and that kind of thing, all right? So I think we're in this weird kind of moment right now where they've decided that it is better to hang together than hang apart, okay? That it's better to be close to the flagpole right now, okay? And to have eyes locked on one another, okay? I have no idea how long that endures. That is an inherently delicate and fragile situation to be in. For the time being, yes, in theory, if he were to withdraw support for what he's doing on the street or use his considerable public stature to condemn Delcy or things like that, on con masodando or whatever, you could start seeing, but we're not there yet. That would be signs of a fracture here and that the card table is about to get kicked over and whatnot. We're in the moment where it's best to hang together than apart. That's what's holding us together.
Domino's table.
Bueno, si quieres que sea dominó.
I would say, though, that there are signs that he is returning to the mean, so to speak, of Diosdado.
Diodado's returning to his personal
to his personal mean, exactly, which we all know what it is, right? I think he's, on the continuum, he's way out there. Just by watching El Mazo Dando, which we probably spend way too much time wasting, watching this for signs of things.
Probably three of the only people in the Washington area who do watch it.
The Mazo Dando show after Operation Absolute Resolve was extremely chastened.
Yeah.
It was like an episode I've never seen before in my life, right? He had no board. He didn't call anybody out. He didn't go through any tweets of opposition. I don't even know if the mazo was on the desk.
No tanto dando el mazo. Huh?
Exactly. Con no sé qué, right? I don't know what he was, but it was very empty, very chastened. Yeah. This past episode, the mazo was back out. He had his board. He was attacking people. So there's signs that, he's reverting back to the mean for him.
Yeah. That he feels more comfortable. Yeah. Right now to be himself because he feels like he's going to be able to survive, right? Rather than be this chastened figure, which didn't suit him. Yeah.
I'd like to give each of the speakers a chance to share their final thoughts. Brian, can you start?
Look, these past 19 days have been a complete whirlwind on Venezuela. I have been through many a previous whirlwind going back to 2001 or whatever. As I said before, so much of what's happened was not on my bingo card. And I think it's leaving people needing more time to figure out how they're going to find their bearings here going forward. I think that, quite frankly, the one part that bothers me the most in terms of the path we're on right now is what has happened with the prospects for a democratic transition in Venezuela. The mala praxis, or what do you say in English? The malpractice, politically it has been practiced on Venezuela over the years. It's just been horrific. Now that the United States has intervened, we own a part of this problem in a way that we didn't own before. And I am concerned about our ability to engage constructively going forward here. But I am prepared to see, how are we coming out of this in the coming weeks here. It's going to be really critical to maintain vigilance in terms of how things evolve here in the future, and to speak up as to how we see things evolving and what needs to happen down there.
Today's January 22nd. Venezuela today is closer to breakdown than it was on January 1st, but it's also closer to redemocratization than it was on January 1st. And so I'm hoping for that outcome, but it's going to take a great deal of effort from everyone involved. So
a Delta Force raid was not on my bingo card. A land strike on Venezuela was on my bingo card. I've been saying it for months, credibility of U.S. foreign policy, the assets we had positioned in the region, et cetera. What I expected was more of a traditional shock and awe campaign. And what we got was the highly surgical, precise takeout of the two elements of the tumor that Brian mentioned, and the biopsy, the very precise biopsy. with the rest of the cancer left, and now all the questions that surround the fact that the cancer is still there. And I think John hit the nail on the head, right? It's simultaneously we can be closer to a very unstable situation in Venezuela, but also closer to democracy. But in order to close on a bright note, I think those of us who have gotten a chance to meet Maria Corina, to forge a relationship with her over the last couple of years as she's been the face of the Venezuelan opposition, getting to know her, you understand immediately this is generational leadership. This is someone who's much different than the rest of the opposition that we've all also met. And so if there's anyone who can keep herself relevant and keep the idea of a transition front and center of these conversations, it's her. So I'll close with that to close on a positive note.
Thanks, Ryan. I want to thank the three of you for thank you for illuminating the landscape and some of the potential pitfalls and opportunities ahead. Thank you to our audience for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks everyone.